Max, just the other day, or yesterday, in fact, there were walkouts here in Minnesota because students are upset about the ice, and I don't mean the ice on the roads here.
I was going to say, are you upset about ice in Minnesota? That seems odd.
Right. No, people like the ice. They like to drive their four-wheelers on it and then drill holes through it and then catch large fish in the winter. That's a grumpy old men, kind of culture. Immigration custom enforcement, of course, and they are in Minnesota. They had been, and there was some drama around it, but then there was a recent surge of ICE troops, or whatever you call them, and officers. And this was in the wake, of course, of the uproar. And, stories come in waves, right? Like the fraud in Minnesota from largely the Somali community has been in the news for years, here anyway, and here and there. Like, our news media wasn't that focused on it, which is a criticism, but it was known. It was mentioned here and there. And then recently it's gotten a lot of national attention. I don't know if you've recognized that. And then because of that, it reached the top. And so Trump sent ICE here, and that got students at some schools in the suburbs of the Twin Cities mad. And so they staged these walkouts, and that made the news. And the reason I mention that is because here we have an institution of a public school, a suburban public school, where it's being disrupted because of, you could say, mismanagement and overlooking the issue of illegal immigration, and then them now trying to play catch up. And so you could credit that. But what I credit more than anything is just how quickly word gets out about ICE coming to town, how people are there following ICE around with their cell phones, how there are tweets going out in real time of where these officers are, who they're putting under arrest, who they're putting in their vehicles, and then students who quickly mobilize to organize a walkout. Schools that wrote letters home or emails home to parents and to the community at large, saying where they stood. And Minnesota, in general, at least the front-facing, politically correct Minnesota, which is much of the leadership in this state, was, we are not for this, we're against this. And I think a lot of this is anti-Trump recoil, personally. And so you just have this push-pull, action-reaction, drama, and I think it's technology. I think it's what I've mentioned, the phones, the ability to mobilize online, the ability to get messages out to large amounts of people instantaneously, the election of a firebrand like Trump who throws fuel into all that. And what I see is how kids but it's even disrupting the ability for students to go learn geography, reading, writing, arithmetic. And I just see this general disruption all over, from the effectiveness of policing to students going to school. And I continue to see this things in this single entity called the USA, or even at the state level, coming apart. And this is not a new observation, but I see you as a giant in this intellectual field of observing this, of writing about it, of making observations, predictions. And so, yeah, I just offer you that one example, and there are countless of them right now in the U.S., in Minnesota especially, I think, being sort of at the front lines of so much unraveling of, say, order. Whether it's, let's just get kids to school on time and teach them geography, or an effective police force, which is challenged in Minneapolis greatly following George Floyd, or managing a state budget, which is challenged because of fear of not wanting to come down on members of an ethnic group because of the publicity that'll give you. And the fear of the publicity is because of the reach of the internet. So all of this, I think, largely stems from tech. And I don't know if you disagree with that at all, but I'm just giving you that observation. And, maybe we can start this because you are such a visionary when it comes to these phenomena. What are your thoughts on Minnesota? And I don't know, maybe you don't pay too much attention to it. And certainly I do because I live here, but I think it stands out in the nation as a interesting case of all the states being in the news so much the last 5-6 years. At least I think it has been, comparatively to what we are used to. And I think it's for a lot of these reasons of things just not working the way we're used to in a world that's much more fluid and in conflict. And we're not handling that well up here. And I don't know, but please share about that.
There's so many layers to this and I appreciate the way you introduced me to this as someone who is, as you put it, a giant of commentary on such issues. I think for me, where I come up short is in having to reconcile apparent contradictions, right? And I say apparent because I think so much of this age that we live in, which is a liminal age, creates uncertainty around what principles to apply, right?
So what do you mean by liminal?
Liminality is this idea that we're going through change. We're going through transformative change. That change manifests itself rather chaotically in certain ways. So let me just talk about it in terms of what I would call my internal struggle. Okay. I like the idea of exiting and entering systems and reducing the costs of doing so. I call this subversive innovation, an innovation that allows you to exit a system that isn't working for you and reduce the costs of doing so, and enter a system that is better for you, is something that, generally speaking, I approve of. What we have, though, in the legacy system that is the United States immigration system.
If I may, so a smaller example of that might be like, this school district, like let's say you're in a metro area with many schools around. This school isn't working for me and my children, so we're going to pull them from here and we're going to send them to that school.
Is that an example of that? Among many. But I also think that I also really do believe more in a right of, at minimum, federalism, which is the let's call it the devolution of power away from the federal government to the states, such that the states as jurisdictions have a lot more authority over their own affairs. Okay. The extent of that decentralization, that devolution of power is a question that we could argue about. And, many people want to see the status quo, completely unified society that is run from Washington, and pretty much all of the rules gravitate upwards to the federal government and not downwards to local municipalities, localities, regional authorities, and so on. I'm pretty much wedded to that latter notion because I think we are better able to apply local knowledge locally to form the communities based more on our conceptions of the good, our localized or proximate or culturally relevant conceptions of the good. And we can take this logic to a degree well beyond what most Americans would, where most Americans might stop at something like, okay, whatever, let's just enforce the Ninth and 10th Amendments to the Constitution, but still have a constitutional order and still have much of what gets decided and done carried out in Washington. I, however, am much more radical than that, as you well know. And I am, generally speaking, very much for migrating out of systems that don't work and into systems that do work. But that requires something of a porous membrane, with emphasis on the membrane. Okay. And so that a membrane also means a right of exclusion on the part of the current members of that jurisdiction, that group of people, that self-determining group that gives rise to the norms, practices, rules, and so on of that jurisdiction. What we have currently in the United States is a titanic tug of war over federal power. And the states are pushing back, which I like, but the mode and manner of the pushback I actually don't like. So I seem to be filled with contradiction, and that's because I am, and I'm trying to reconcile that contradiction a little bit. But one way I would do so is to say that to become part of a jurisdiction, to become, let's think of it more like becoming a member of a club.
Mm-hmm.
To become a member of the club, you have to be dispositionally and doctrinally ready to accept the culture, mores, and auspices of that club, okay? Of that mutual association, jurisdiction, and so on, right? And I think what we are seeing, not to a heavy degree, but not like there is in Europe, but we're seeing a problem in that we have been, at least between 2000 and 2024, inviting people, and I think for you in Minnesota, it's gone on far longer. We're inviting too many people into a system where, as Milton Friedman reminded us, when you have a large welfare state, it is too easy for too many people to come and become dependent on that welfare state, which is obviously what we're seeing in the Somali community in Minnesota. But not just that dependency, also the fraud. So if there is a culture of taking advantage of, let's call them liberal systems, whatever the features or properties of that liberal system, if you view it as a system to be gamed and not as a fundamental doctrine to be adopted and to assimilate into a culture that's meant to be a healthy, let's say, social safety net or liberal order, and by liberal I mean concerned with a free people, then there's going to be a corruption as people come to the country and attempt to set up based on their preconceived conceptions of the good and not what exists here already, or not what we would aspirationally like to see as a majority within some system. So the long and short of it is for there to be a jurisdiction that you are invited into, it has to have a set of standards, and you have to be willing to accept and embrace those standards. And that I think we are not seeing, for example, in Europe, where immigration has become a real problem. We're starting to see civilizational culture clashes. And those culture clashes mean it's exceedingly difficult for people to integrate or assimilate into the dominant society, which is what one would expect, or at least hope, if we have any prayer of preserving the liberal order that the United States established through the founding and over the years has been corrupted through multiple means and vectors. So the way I would reconcile that is, if I could implement my own way of doing things, it would be we would have more regional authorities that controlled immigration. We would undo this whole business of apportionment in the Constitution, where all you have to do is count bodies through the census in order to apportion congressional seats. And I think the backlash that we're seeing from immigration, the reason it is different from the era of Barack Obama, where the deportations were higher and more numerous, is that there hadn't been a background strategy of leveraging apportionment to keep power. You will notice that the three states who have the most sort of violent backlash against deportations are states like California, Illinois, and New York, all of which are losing population because they're poorly governed. And when you have poorly governed states, people defect. The Americans are leaving. So they're having to import bodies in order to keep power.
Mm-hmm.
And that's cynical as hell, in my view.
Sure.
It also means that there are cultural and, let's call them, doctrinal or otherwise sort of philosophical forces at play in some of these places where they don't really come to appreciate the civil order of the United States as a constitutional republic. They don't give a shit about that. They really just want to come here and either get on the dole or work. And I think one compromise might be to say, okay, you've got to work. And if you don't work, then you got to go, you know? But I think unless you have a means of helping people to assimilate, to adopt sort of the credo of the U.S. constitutional order, you're going to see it, as it has in Europe, start to dissolve, and the people who are coming into these areas balkanize and want to set up their own conceptions of the good, their own societies, as it were, whether that be through Sharia law or whether that be through, just gaming the system or, yeah. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. What I'm wondering is if this is just one manifestation of something that was practically inevitable given the internet. Because you look at when the internet came around and social media, I remember when Ron Paul ran. Now he wouldn't have gotten much attention in the 80s or the early mid 90s or late 90s probably. But 2008, when he first ran for president, he did get attention because YouTube was around then. Facebook was around then. Yeah. And Twitter was probably just around then. And it was enough of some social media for there to have this first viral candidate, I would argue. And so he punched way above his weight in terms of crowds and delegates in our state. We're a caucus state. We're not a primary state, if that's the right terminology. And so Ron Paul did really well here.
He was really our first internet president. I think you could fairly argue.
Correct.
Yeah.
Candidate anyway. And so that was 2008. 2009, you had Occupy Wall Street. You had the Tea Party. Black Lives Matter came around in, I think, the mid-teens, like 2014, 15.
Yeah.
Me Too. Like you had all these movements that have come from both sides, and all kinds of non-establishment candidates that have done well. Trump being the best example of that. But there are others like Bernie Sanders that also did surprisingly well for the Democrats.
Yeah.
And so you just get this kind of coming apart again that I mentioned at the beginning, and whether it's backlash over Trump or backlash over immigrant crime or mismanagement of things, I'm trying to paint this general picture, and what I'm wondering is if there's, like, we can talk about the specifics of how we could handle a particular issue like immigration. But what I'm wondering is, in a way, does it really matter? Because the U.S. as an entity or Germany as an entity or whatever, like these nation states, they're no longer compatible with, and I'm not calling for the downfall of a nation state of the USA. I'm just trying to speak practically, like maybe it's just not a system anymore that is practical. It's not compatible with the technology we have. And so we're seeing all of these different ways in which people are operating, people are moving, people are communicating, people are creating events and protests and so forth. Not so much because there's a particular bad person in office doing particularly bad things, but because it's just not a fit anymore for how the state of our society technologically.
So, you know that back in 2018, I came out with a book called The Social Singularity.
Mm-hmm.
And that book was both prediction and aspiration. And in that book, which has been my most popular to date. So, whatever that means, I'm happy about it because I set out a vision of decentralization in that book. And that vision is more a systems or theoretical level. It does mention examples such as the unification but continued sort of federalism of Switzerland, right?
Mm-hmm.
Switzerland is a federal republic, so there's a lot of power at the level of the canton. And so that's one of the sort of basic ideas. I think maybe I can't remember if I compared Vermont to New Hampshire, which is one of my favorite comparisons. It's one of the most free states. They're neighboring each other. It's one of the freest states versus among the least free states on a lot of dimensions. And happy to report that New Hampshire tends to outperform in most ways Vermont in terms of cost of living, crime, and so on, right? Business formation, economic indicators, what have you, they tend to win out. It's still a very narrow band, though, compared to the weight of the federal government over all of the society. So here's the way I would like and my thought is that as we approach this social singularity, which is a theoretical point beyond which our technology-enabled lateralized relationships would enable people to self-organize to a far greater degree. And this Westphalian model of the nation state would start to reveal its cracks. Yeah. Okay? You just pointed out that you think it is doing that it is revealing its cracks.
I do.
But it's in a phase and it's taking a long time because that was 8 years ago. So 2 more years, it'll be a decade old book.
I anticipate it'll take many decades.
I think you're probably right. But what we have seen is that technology has helped us become far from becoming more creating self-organizing communities, which is the hope and the promise of the social singularity. What it has done is made us into more degenerate political animals, okay? And by political animal, I'm using the thought that, picking a political team and engaging in political team sports online, this is causing us to fracture in the sense that we're picking more and more different teams. First, it was the left, where the left saw this sort of aggressive social justice fundamentalism in the woke movement or whatever. And I think that started to cause people on the moderate left to say, okay, I don't recognize this anymore and I don't want any part of it. And reasonably so, right? Because it became kind of like crazy day. On the right, as a response to that, we started to see a backlash, okay? But that backlash has become more errant, more contrarian, and frankly, uglier, whether it's crazy conspiracy theories or anti-Semitism or just overt racism. And look, I don't like to hear anyone talk about racism at every turn, that the source of every problem in the country
Right.
is some kind of
Right.
privilege or some kind of racism, systemic this or structural that, right? That is an virtually unfalsifiable theory that means we don't ever have to take responsibility for anything, either politically or personally, in terms of policy change or personal change. And so
And there's never enough the offending people can do to amend it.
That's right. So what they did instead was to become the backlash. And in becoming the backlash, they became troglodytic, really ugly.
It's a race to the bottom, right?
It's a race to the bottom.
I think we're seeing that with candidates. When you first have an abundance of food, like we've had over the last 100 years, right? A lot of people abuse that. I abuse that, but some people abuse it more, and some people abuse it when they really shouldn't. They have diabetes, they're really unhealthy or whatever. And so those who can learn to moderate the sugar, the stuff that tastes good right away, are the long-term winners here. And I think the same is the case with the internet. Right now, we're just gorging on sugar, which is the reactivity, which is the outrage, which is the gasping. You'll never guess what they did. Look at that. Look what they did. And that's really part of this race to the bottom. And I think to hang over indeed, because we're really suffering from socially. And so what I don't know yet is if we're going to stop eating sugar in a content, political, rhetorical standpoint. Like, are we going to change the language of politics to get out of this sugary junk food diet and get to some more meaningful, important stuff, or no? And are we going to have to eventually, maybe fracture because people just do not want to be governed by someone like Trump?
Well, everybody's
something like that.
Still managing to worship in the church of politics, but there's a massive schism in the church. I wish, my hope, as I pointed out before, is that we use technological means to self-organize communities according to our conception of the good and live and die by those commitments, right? Rather than engage in political tug of war between left and right.
Do you see that happening too?
What's that?
There is some self-organizing, is there not? It's understated, but I think if you look for it, you find it.
It's primarily organizing for activism. The fact that a bunch of high school or college kids can very quickly use social media to come in and hector people who are ICE agents who are deporting people, just as the Messiah Barack Obama did in those years. Somehow things have become very different, and they have suddenly a different cultural sensibility. I have my doubts about that. I think it's political team sports. If the left had been the ones engaging in it, I think engaging in the practice of deportation, I think they would have bent over backwards to apologize for it, because I think the tribal coalitional affiliations that are still cracking up, don't get me wrong, they're still splintering and fracturing along certain fault lines. But I think if it's very easy for partisans, it's sort of like the old Euthyphro question of God: is something good because God says it's good, or is it good independently of God, which makes us wonder about the relationship between God and morality? It's the old Euthyphro problem of Plato. It's replace God with party, and it's like, do we support something because this is generally our partisan direction, or is it independently just and good, and we want our party to adopt it as a position? I think very often with tribal coalitional thinking, people do it in a Bass-Ackard's way, in the sense that there are no principles.
principle is long gone out the window.
Right.
I
It's like,
I,
what benefits my team and
I
its
do
power?
see. I do see. I like the way you phrase that. And maybe you'll have to help me rephrase it. Did you say lateral or lateral connections? And what I
Mhm.
envision there is people self-organizing, like you said, laterally. So we're all equals. We're all part of this thing. And I actually do see that. I see that in Facebook groups, support groups. And because of like, there's way more good than bad happening from the internet. We've talked about a lot of the disruption and the social and the chaos, but like someone could be a quadriplegic in the middle of North Dakota and have no way of ever getting to meet many, if any, people like him or her. And now because of social media, they could probably join a support group of paraplegics in the thousands, in whatever country they live in.
Yeah, this is a good way. This is a good way to put it, Brandon. I think I've always been, and I used to teach about this as early as 2001 when I used to teach at university. Right, I would talk about the transition from hierarchies as a model of organization for human beings into networks. Right, and of course, the decentralization technologies that have come about since the Bitcoin protocol was introduced. Well, even before that, I mean, I think one could argue that something like Uber was a decentralization technology, even
Yeah,
though it's not
sure.
decentralized at that level of the stack. It still facilitates peer-to-peer interaction,
Yes.
and thus also so do some of the social media
Yeah. Yeah.
apps. Okay,
100%.
but the transition that we're experiencing while we're going from this top-down model of information and idea dissemination. So think about like pre-2014, most of our information and good opinion came from the major networks, the major newspapers, big prominent websites. Did I say the universities? Did I say Hollywood? Right? There were these
Yeah.
big in government. So you have this very top down
Yeah.
broadcast dissemination down hierarchical chains of command. And all of us were at the bottom of it. Right. Whereas communications, we started to really organize in communications in a different way, such that ABC, CBS, NBC are kind of dinosaurs and nobody gives a shit about them anymore. Excuse my mouth. That breakup of those media oligopolies and monopolies has allowed us to form more nested networks within a greater network. But that the trade-off there is it creates filter bubbles. It's harder to have social coherence around anything, to your point about technological change. But what we're still doing in these nested networks is fighting over the old legacy hierarchical system that politics creates in America, right? So while we fundamentally disrupted our means of communication and mass media around a much more peer-driven model, which has caused these nested networks, has caused these filter bubbles, which has caused this political fracturing, we haven't yet shed ourselves of the notion that top-down politics, where we fight
That's right.
over somebody ruling over everybody else and distributing the rules and interpreting the laws, is the way to govern ourselves. It's not. And the founders knew that, and yet we seem to be moving in a direction where we're fighting over who gets to run the apparatus of the hierarchy and more of that. So we're becoming more networked, more anarchic in our communication space, but that is done in service of a far more authoritarian and hierarchical
Right.
state of affairs on both sides as
Well,
they
that's well
vie
put.
for power over it.
That's why I don't think it's compatible. And I think if you look at the big picture, I know it's a radical statement to say it's incompatible, because then you're basically saying that It's not going to work, and we shouldn't try to make it work. And then it's like, okay, you just want the country to go away. You want the U.S. to break up. I mean, it's pretty radical stuff. I'm not suggesting
Right.
that
And
immediately.
my answer is yes, I do.
Well, that's why I predict a multi-decades process that I hope is a soft landing rather than a crash and burn. And I remember when Biden and Trump ran, when Biden came out on top, I thought, okay, well, at least that might help us, because I don't want to crash land. And Trump's first term was like, oh man, we've lost altitude. It's getting ugly. And then Biden got in there, but it was also ugly in a different way.
I think what I'm observing in what you just described is still this fidelity to the cult of the presidency, right? And to me, America, and this sounds like rather cliche, but America is an idea. America, in fact, is an idea that was set out in what I believe was our first great charter. And that is not the Articles of Confederation, although that is, I think it was a mistake to abandon that for what has turned out to be a constitution that has made, in which Thomas Jefferson, the author of our real charter, which is the Declaration of Independence, was overtaken by Alexander Hamilton's view of the country, which is strong centralization and a top-heavy federal government that is accelerating toward fiscal calamity, if not cultural collapse as well. And I wrote a book about that called After Collapse, and I remain deeply troubled by the debt levels where none of the creatures in Congress seem to be able to cinch up the power of the purse. And eventually we're going to have some sort of sovereign default or accelerated even hyperinflation. And in such a situation, we're going to, the cultural aspect is going to have to adapt or die. And this could be seen as an opportunity. I agree with you. I'm more of a Burkean in this regard. Can we very slowly enter the social singularity? Not because we have developed a set of protocols and people have opted into these systems because they were permitted to by the powers that be. That would be the ideal situation. But stuff ain't looking that way. What it looks like is we're going to have to endure something like a Great Depression and also a collapse of a highly centralized concentration of power in Washington and New York, that's going to be broken up as well through it's collapsing under its own weight. That's going to be awful. But even in that dire situation, we have to understand it as an opportunity to reconstitute something far more decentralized and healthy that isolates the cancerous ideologies to at least smaller jurisdictions and allows the better institutional frameworks to flourish and perhaps even, overtake the other ones as they realize that what they've done has gone and screwed up. Because if you create Mamdani-stan in the mold of New York, right, and everybody leaves and goes to your jurisdiction with good rules, it will become apparent after a time that the dynamics of jurisdictional arbitrage are far, far stronger if there is no federal umbrella with all the guns and jails to force us into a shitty system that isn't working.
So you said that was the name of your book, After Collapse?
Yeah, it's another one of my books.
So does it basically, is the premise basically, hey, we should be more open about the impending situation here that may not be here next year or in 5 years, may take 50, but let's get to work right now on building this ark for the coming flood. Is that kind of what your book says?
That's a beautiful summary. Yeah, I think so. And
Okay, I like that.
I don't talk about the one true way. Okay. One thing I
Sure.
resist doing is trying to talk about the one true way. It's too much of a rationalist approach to things where you come up with some 5-year plan and, expect that everybody, by virtue of what, I don't know, is going to adhere to it. Instead, what I suggest is that we consider many different alternative systems that can be realized, tried, and tested at the most local feasible level, and the ones that endure will, in evolutionary fashion, emerge as a new paradigm.
Right on. Yeah, and it's very American to not have a president dictate how we should plan for this coming flood, right? That might be what China does, and it might do it well because that's just how they do things over there.
Who
But this is
knows?
the U.S.
Never
This is
underestimate the
yeah.
Chinese, right? But yeah, I think what the way we have a spirit still, we're losing it. We still have a spirit though that is Alexis de Tocqueville, that we are a nation of joiners, that we're a nation of people who self-organize into associations based on missions. And if we can get it together as organizers of these associations, we can start to form parallel institutions that get us through these bad times. And at the very least, have these be the basic infrastructure for what is the next paradigm.
It's so hard to, I think it's so hard. It's hard for me, and it's hard for, I think, just about anyone to keep their eye on that prize when there is something more imminent that is getting everyone else talking. Oh, ICE is in town. Oh, there's a protest going on. Oh, we need to get this representative elected to Congress. Oh, this, all that. And it's hey, there's a giant meteor coming to Earth. Don't worry so much about, who's going to win whatever in 2028. This is a bigger thing. We need to start building here. We need to build the ark, that kind of thing.
It's interesting too, because, politics as, a kind of almost religious phenomenon. And I use the church of politics metaphor quite deliberately. What that does is it creates a situation where we're simultaneously short-sighted and too far-sighted, right? We're too short-sighted in the sense that the only dynamics are what the next election is. And how are we going to make sure that the other side doesn't take power, or worry that the other side's going to take power and this and that, or get them better organized
and win at all costs.
And win at all costs. And it becomes trench warfare that happens every 2 to 4 years, depending on the magnitude of of the election. So that's the short-sightedness. The far-sighted aspect of it is, instead of thinking about who's going to be sent to Washington 2 years from now, or sent to the White House 3 or 4 years from now, we should be thinking about developing a set of protocols that allow for emergent communities to form and start to find their footing. That has immediate feedback effects, right? We want the feedback loops to be tighter, more tightly coupled, as they put it in the complexity science space. But what we have now are these kind of loose loops and this kind of amorphous, sort of titanic information war or mind war battles over who gets to control the political apparatus. But that still makes us simultaneously short-sighted and overly far-sighted as we become rationalistic in trying to plan who gets to win and this and that. It doesn't introduce the tightly coupled feedback loops, and it doesn't introduce ones that have more to do with community and voluntary association and less to do with politics.
It's out of rhythm, out of flow from the pace, from the music of the way society operates in the internet age.
Beautiful.
There's a well-known podcast out there in the cryptocurrency world called What Bitcoin Did.
Yep.
And this guy has some pretty big guests on, and it's apparently a successful, wonderfully run podcast that's looking at these big topics of how changing the money changes the world. Like, these are big things. I've often thought of, I don't think I'm going to do this, but the idea of having a podcast called, or a documentary or something called What the Internet Did, because these are such I remember you mentioning the sovereign individual in a previous interview that I watched of yours, and that book is what did it for me. I listened to that book. It was referenced on some tweets from like 5-10 years ago that I saw, and I don't know what it was about it, but it got my attention, and I got the audiobook and I listened to the thing, and I remember it literally stopping me in my tracks from time to time. Where I remember exactly where I was one time walking along this trail where I live, where I stopped because I was like, "Holy cow, this is what's happening right now."
Yeah.
It really opened my eyes, and for those who aren't familiar, what I really took from it anyway was just this idea of how, hey, the printing press did this to Europe and to the Catholic Church, and the internet's going to do this to us now.
Right.
And it's gonna unfold with blood and chaos. It doesn't have to be as bloody or as drawn out as it was then, but going from kingdom to country, we're going to go from country to something else. And it's why I, and maybe you, have been following Prospera so closely.
Yeah.
Because I think that might be that something else. Something like it will be that something else, a network state.
Or 1,000 Prosperas.
Yeah.
If we have to come, try to form little miniature special jurisdictions within some existing political substrate, but it is functions as a carve out, so be it. These can become let's call them, the niches of experimentation that allow us to see whether this is going to be better. But even if we could just take the metaphor, one of the metaphors I used before Bitcoin came out is, what if we governed ourselves and established more governments that function more like Facebook groups? You know what a Facebook group is? They can kick you out. You can join. You can leave one and go to another. And the one that comports most with your conception of the good and your communitarian conceptions, I like the people in this group. We share sensibilities, moral sensibilities, ideas about justice, whatever it is. It doesn't matter if you're left, right, center, or orthogonally much more authoritarian or decentralist. It does matter if you're more authoritarian, because you then resist the very model. But at least within that group, that Facebook group, you can establish a much more top-down system that people might want to submit themselves to for whatever reason, because they don't want to participate in governance so much, or they like the sort of like people who go to Singapore. It's like,
there's good leadership. The trains run on time.
The trains run on time. It's a benign dictatorship. It's still a dictatorship, which makes me uncomfortable. But the fact that it's a small jurisdiction and they have to constantly vie for customers to move there, citizens as customers rather than citizens as, born onto a patch of soil and are expected to be run by its auspices just because, it's an artifact of war and history, not of choice and self-organization. So I think learning the lesson of choice and self-organization, even though we're living in that era in terms of our online communities, we're not yet ready to do that in meat space. I thought we'd be further along by now, but we're not.
Well, the idea of competing police forces or like these sorts of things are really big ideas. And the political groups who would tend to favor free market, freedom, the conservatives are the ones who are the opposite of believing in multiple police forces. Right? They're like, no, we need to bolster up the police. Do you see kind of the paradox there?
Yeah, it's like the difference between left and right is which monopoly power you prefer. It's like, What we're trying to say is
Yeah.
that we agree with you that monopolies are bad. And the biggest monopoly we have of all is the federal government. Let's
Right.
break it up.
Yeah. But to be unpatriotic and to not salute the flag you're not welcome in the Republican Party if you're not standing for the national anthem.
Right. Well, I would say to that as like, have you read Thomas Jefferson? Have you read the Declaration of Independence? Which to my mind is just crystallizes so much about the American soul, the soul that if we were going to return to anything to make America great again, it is the revolutionary zeal that is expressed in that document, but also its doctrine of rights and freedoms. I philosophically I quibble with it. I don't necessarily believe in a theological justification of rights. But I do believe in the consent of the governed, and I think we get there no matter whether you believe in a theological justification of rights or that rights are determined legally through other means, i.e., self-organization and choice, which is where I land on the matter. Doesn't matter. The point is, to be an American is to want that, in my view, and to be anything else is to, look, I'm defining things for my own purposes, rhetorically, and I acknowledge that because someone like an Alexander Hamilton gets to count as American as apple pie in as much as compared with Thomas Jefferson. But if you go back to the American founding and pit them against each other ideologically, I want to move towards the Jefferson side and not the Hamilton side. And the means by which we do that might not be as much like the French Revolution as it is a Burkean conception. Nevertheless, whatever the sweet spot is to realize that consent of the governed business is what I'm after.
I believe that nothing is stopping the I took I made this I took a picture of like the meme of the most conservative American ever. It's like this guy with the flag in one hand, a shotgun in the other. He looks like he's on some farm in Iowa. And I have him on one side, and on the other side is whatever, purple hair, piercings, rainbow flag, whatever. You get the stereotypes. And I thought,
Yeah.
the only reason why these two people don't get along, besides the obvious, they're not into the same things probably. But the reason why, I'll rephrase that, not the reason why they don't get along, but the reason why they don't like each other, the reason why they're mad at each other is because they see each other as a threat. Well, why would they see each other as a threat? Why do they even cross paths? Well, they cross paths at the voting booth.
Right.
Because if he wins, she doesn't want to see the 10 Commandments in her kid's school. And if she wins, she doesn't want his tax dollars to go fund something at the theater. And they're both right. They're both right as far as I'm concerned. So the problem is that why do we even have these things decided, imposed? Like that's the problem. Like why can't she have a school and a arts and entertainment that she prefers that is funded through the patrons of that, and he's not forced to pay for it. And then she's not forced to have in her school, her kid's school, something that reflects his religion, right?
That's how the federal government attempts to maintain social coherence, is that it adopts a single standard and then makes that standard contingent on your receiving federal largesse at the state level. And that's got to stop. In other words, these resources should never be extracted from the states to begin with. And then states, at the very least, can live and die by their own systems.
It'll just, what will be determined is how that gets resolved. Is it going to get resolved through collapse? Or is it going to get resolved through like willing relinquishment? Elon went to the federal government. Elon Musk went to the federal government to institute Doge and or to facilitate Doge and attempt to clean up some things, and it didn't work apparently.
No, it was like
So
they went ape shit. They were all piggies at the trough, squeal, 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 and you know, and then they started becoming more and more violent. Look, this is the other really, really problematic aspect of it. We are going backsliding we went from bullets to ballots. And then we're backsliding from ballots to bickering and from bickering back to bullets. This is of real concern to me. We're seeing a bigger escalation in political violence. And it doesn't always manifest itself as, say, Charlie Kirk getting shot or Melissa,
right
from
here.
From your state getting killed by the guy who is still a mystery to me, but that's another conversation. What was her name? The state senator, Melissa
Hortman,
yeah. We're seeing an uptick in this kind of political violence that doesn't end up in murder, but it's also ending up in just, street clashes, throwing rocks through people's windows, destroying property and cars, hitting someone in the face with a giant tire iron or chain or something like that.
I documented it here when Trump came. I did a story called "When Trump Comes to Town."
Yeah,
and when he had a rally in Minneapolis in 2020 or 2019, and I was right there in front of the Target Center where the Timberwolves play basketball, where Trump went, and I followed these unlucky MAGA guys who went in through the wrong entrance. They were supposed to go in through the Skyway, which are a system of one-story above ground tubes that connect much of downtown Minneapolis because of our winters. And they were supposed to enter through a parking garage and then go through the Skyway directly into the Target Center, but they came in through the front, and that's where all the protesters were. So they walked the gauntlet. And yeah, it's really some good footage, but it's like I should have had I almost should have had, not to downplay real war correspondence, but it was almost like I should have had a bulletproof vest and a press thing on my helmet just to let people know, hey, I'm not with these guys. Don't harass me. But yeah, they got the business big time.
I bet. And look, as things become more violent, has been for longer on the left. The ends justify the means. Exita acta probat, I think is the Latin for that. That is the idea that the ends justify the means. To do whatever you got to do because you're in the right. You're serving justice. Everybody thinks they're serving justice. And so
that's why it's fine. That's why it's fine to block traffic for the climate.
Block traffic, kill people, use violence, use what by any means necessary, right?
Yep.
This is becoming much more problematic, but it's not just that. It's the idea of cheating in elections or ripping off the social welfare system or whatever is also becoming much more commonplace. It's like, we're in the right, we're in the good. Let's game the system to whatever degree possible. And so that we can win.
Yeah, it's messy.
And so we don't have any kind of national standard for the way elections are run. People are I think it's 20-something states don't have voter ID, which would still not be helpful entirely. But it's like, if you're going to worship in the church of politics, you at least ought to have a system where you talk a big game about democracy, which is majoritarian rule, that should be protected.
It's like the opposite.
One person
it's
will
like
vote.
The opposite of a good church that teaches morality above outcome.
Yeah, that's right.
Do the right thing regardless of the outcome.
Morality is the outcome when it comes to politics,
Yeah.
and
Even if the immediate outcome for you is, be honest, if you got too much change back from the cashier, that kind of thing. Yeah, you're gonna lose money, but you're whatever. You have integrity.
yeah,
It's a degeneration of spirituality, not in the Holy Spirit necessarily, if you're not a religious person, but the soul
yeah,
of a human. All
yeah.
right, if you're willing to cheat or just play dirty or just be mean and cruel in name calling and that kind of thing, right? It's really low.
As
And
long as it's in the service of my conception of the good, I can do anything.
well, yeah, I mean, just people getting wrapped up in and I think people are kind of realizing it. Joe Rogan talks a lot about that. And to the degree that he's a thought leader, he might influence others to do the same, but that's to stay off social media. And it's not to say that social media is bad, just like sugar isn't bad, but you can't eat candy all the time. And he's on social media, but he's limiting it, and he appreciates the degree to which fasting from it or putting the phone down for an extended period of time does him a lot of good, and the degree to which getting on in a way that pulls you into an unwell space for you, and one can feel that in their heart. I can anyway. I can tell when I'm getting sunk into what they call doom scrolling and brain
That's right.
rot, whatever. I mean, there's a reason why these terms exist, and sort of like myths. Like they speak the truths, and these terms, highlight these truths about about what it does to our well being when we go down these darker paths because of this tool.
It's true. I think that I think we can all not fairly acknowledge now that whatever you mean by spiritual, that
Yeah,
there is a spiritual malnourishment in the United States.
yeah,
The causes of that spiritual malnourishment are numerous. And in fact, I want to tell you about a project that I'm piloting for young men, because I think young men have been in a great sense over the last 20 years kind of cast aside, been told that they've received negative messages, subtle and overt. And I think a lot of them have turned to digital world for a respite or an escape. And of course, it has those addicting properties that you talked about earlier.
yeah.
Certainly
Well put.
do.
Yeah,
And the doom
addicting.
scrolling aspect, any kind of it can be a little bit of dopamine hit, right? Dopamine, but it can also be an adrenaline rush. And negative provides the adrenaline rush. So it's a way of getting hooked on excitement or getting hooked on something and causing your brain to get sort of milked, I guess, of those properties. That becomes somewhat short term. So young men tend to go from one little moment, one little dopamine hit or drip to the next, and fail to step back and look at the longer view, or undertake a more arduous journey that is going to be much more fruitful and much more fulfilling and spiritually nourishing, even as it comes with challenges and leaves you with scars. But man, so one of the things I'm trying to do is pilot this program for young men. And if anybody's interested, please feel free to contact me. As we if you know of a candidate, a young man between 18 and 28 who might be interested in this, and indeed some of the older gentlemen can be mentors to some of the younger ones, but still be involved in something like this sense of that gives a sense of solidarity and brotherhood and yearning to become more excellent always. So virtue and excellence are going to be part of this, but also becoming men of principle, gentlemen of principle, if you like, where Gentleman reemphasizes this sense of decorum and this sense of restraint and this sense of feeling responsible for something besides self in the next dopamine hit, right? I sound like an old guy who's lecturing young men about the way they ought to be. So instead, what I'm trying to do is create an environment where that just feels right. We're engaging more this way rather than in the daily drip of whether that's dopamine or distraction, helps them in their personal development journeys so that they can grow up to save the world, or they can at least pass the torch, have the torch passed to them to become stewards of our society and of the republic, or of some new paradigm that we develop that is a more consent-based order. So that is a project I'm working on. And I'm here to tell you, Brandon, what motivated me to do that is not just that I have a friend, James, who's dying, and who said it's the most important thing is to be a mentor to young men. And that really inspired me. As he's dying, he's like, I want to help. But also I have a son. I have two sons, as a matter of fact, one 10 and one 19. And, conversations with both reveal sort of that they're trying to overcome this sort of digital torpor and digital depression or what have you. And they do a good job at it. They're great young men, but that inspired me too. Being a father, man, that makes you wake up and ask yourself, what kind of a world am I leaving to my kids? So it needs to be one in which they can find means of spiritual nourishment if they can't get it online.
So I thought the first rule of such a club was not to talk about it.
Ah, shit. You're right. I went and talked about it.
No, seriously. Yeah. When are we going to blow up the Starbucks? No. I'm talking about Fight Club, right?
Yeah.
Okay. I love the idea because I think there's also a growing number of men, young men who don't have the avenue for that kind of mentorship, development that they used to have in the church. A lot of young men are going to the church because you see a lot of thought leaders on X are that way. That are in the, I don't know what you would call it, but if there's a movement, but the kind of guys who talk about the importance of, being a good man, being a strong man, that kind of thing. They tend to be Christian, but there's a lot of young men who aren't Christian. And then what do? Right? And so it sounds like yours is a secular organization. Yes?
Yes.
Yeah.
I
think that's great.
I want to probe questions about the mystery, the great mystery of the universe, or what we might call the cosmic mystery. Ask the question about whether or not that there's a supreme being. I love those kind of conversations. Theological people becoming inspired by theological questions is absolutely, to me, part and parcel to something like this. It doesn't mean that you have to be anything. I spent most of my life as an atheist and now consider myself an agnostic. But I'll tell you truly, my wife is Jewish, and we have a little girl who's 5 years old, and she wants to help her to grow up as a little Jewish girl because it's matrilineal, right? And I absolutely love going Sundays to the synagogue for adult education classes with people who are, some of whom are 30 years my senior. They are, sitting around talking about the Torah with a bunch of old Jews is spiritually nourishing. It's just even the communitarian aspects of a familiar face, of putting on a kippah to show respect to the place. they're just sometimes it's the little things, but it's the same kind of thing that is missing.
Yeah.
So I got to start this young men's project online in order to be able to start it and scale it. It doesn't make sense to do it. I'd much rather do something in person, and
Right.
eventually I hope that it evolves into that. But right now, it does need to be an online phenomenon, and I think that younger men are comfortable with that. It doesn't fully extract them from the digital environment in a way that I would like to, because there's something really special and important about being together where you can give somebody a hug and get the oxytocin instead of the dopamine, right? You can, you can help an elderly person, or you can drop your kids off at, at their Sunday school or whatever. These kind of things that weave the fabric of community are increasingly missing as we give ourselves over to the digital. But I think I can approximate it or synthesize it to a high degree through the means that I'm developing, and it's and and we will likely have an annual event after we set it up and manage to scale it. If we can't, we won't, obviously, but yeah. So you're right about that.
How much have you looked into 12-step meetings? And I mean that as a guide, or as a, like when you research how to best facilitate this new project, have you looked at how 12-step meetings operate? One, as a place of mentorship and connection, but two, as a model for how to do online, in-person, hybrid, online and in person very, very well. So I won't be specific, but I'm a 12-step meeting attender, and it is to get the best of both worlds. You're right. There's nothing like an in-person meeting, but to also be able to not have to drive, because I live out in the edge of the metro.
Yeah.
To not have to drive a half hour into the city. And if there's weather, my car's in the shop right now. Like, if there are these things that are happening, I can get on the meeting and then connect with guys online. And some groups are online only. And if, again, we know the disadvantages, but hello, now I'm on a meeting with a guy from New York, Florida, California, all over the country and Europe. And we're all discussing, this particular matter.
Recovery and whatever else.
Hello.
Right?
I mean, it is I notice a lot, and it kind of makes me want to do like a video on why the internet is awesome, because it gets so, like, Australia just instituted its ban on social media for anyone younger than 16, right? So there's a lot of, and that's not to say that's a good or bad thing, but it's just to say that there's just a general pushback right now against the harms of social media and this and that. But, the Facebook support group, the online 12-step meeting, the homeschool cooperative, or, that's able to connect because of the internet. Like, there's so many good things that this technology allows, that I always see it as it's the disruptor and it's the solution. It's the disruptor and it's the antidote or remedy to our problems. And
it's like like they say about a steak knife, right? You can use it to cut your filet mignon, or you can use it to stab your spouse. Technology's the same way.
Right.
We can
100%.
use it to organize violence around, political agitation or whatever, or we can use it to self-organize in communitarian ways locally, so that we become people who recognize common missions and common needs again, in the manner of like a de Tocqueville, Francis de Tocqueville.
Well, to connect those two examples more, knife is technology.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
Right? I mean, we think of it as wires in electronics, but that's sort of how it's connotatively known. But of course, the dictionary definition is just repurposing something for another task, and sharpening a.
Sorry. Anyway, sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, okay.
Alexis de Tocqueville.
Sharpening a piece of metal to be able to cut.
Say.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, a knife is technology too, right? It's just a very crude and rudimentary technology, unless it's made up of some alloy that has been annealed or something, and through a special process, it's still just something with which you cut or stab, basically.
Yeah, I'm also really interested in just the organizational aspect of what the internet allows, whether it's a remote meeting or what we're doing as we speak in this conversation, having an interview, a sit down, a conversation while you're in 1,000 miles away or more from me. But when it comes to jurisdictions, and we find that more and more of our lives goes online, and more of what we need protection from is online. Like we bank online, way more than we bank in paper. So we don't have to worry so much about someone putting a gun to our back and taking our wallet. We need to worry about someone robbing us in the digital world. So we need protection from that. But I don't know, like, have you thought about just that difficult, if we are going to have jurisdictions, network states, as Balaji Srinivasan talks about, and has created a whole school and movement around, um, it seems like perhaps the future of I don't even know what you call it. Like what is a country? What is a kingdom? It is a society. It's an organized society.
Yeah, I think a society, a community, a society, an association. There are all kinds of words that approximate what we're getting at, but the point is that there is a high degree of social coherence among the people who organize themselves together, right?
And how do you do that in a world that is digital and that is a hybrid, digital and in person? Like we're so used to geographically based societies.
Mm-hmm.
And so because of that, in America, you're born here, you're a citizen here, and you get taxed. Well, even no matter where you go in the world, but it's very geographically based. If you live in this city, this police will take care of you,
Yeah.
or protect you in theory. But when we have a more online world, we can have a more online
Set of commitments
society.
and even yeah, like so one of my favorite theories, one of the things I like to refer to myself to as an asymptotic anarchist or a directional anarchist. And all of that means is I realize that we live in a time and place where there's always going to be impediments and people who are powerful who are going to stick their hands in my pocket or point a gun at me to make sure I pay my taxes and comply by the rules that they set up for us based on representative government, blah, blah, blah. But that there is a North Star to which we can all aspire, which means a much more competitive state of affairs. And we might get closer and closer to it without ever actually getting there, right? And that's called, I call that asymptotic anarchy, because an asymptote gets closer and closer to the line without ever reaching it, right? But there's this theory that sort of jives with that called panarchy by Paul-Émile Dupuy. He's a Belgian, if I recall, is a Belgian classical liberal philosopher who published his panarchy essay. Pretty sure it was 1860 or 1861. I think the same year that might have been the same year that Marx published Das Kapital or the Communist Manifesto, one of them. And one took off and one got roundly ignored, but the time for Dupuy has come, his panarchy. And the idea is that we can conceive of non-territorial sort of jurisdictional associations to join, that they function more like subscription services or clubs than countries. So you and I might have similar values and so want to belong to the same club, and we subscribe to it and we pay the fees associated and we get the benefits from it. Could be a mutual association, could be a kind of form of mutual insurance. It could be more than that. It could be something that, involves health insurance, burial insurance. It has all kinds of benefits that government tends to want to provide or regulate at the federal level. And so we decide that we want to join one of these mutual aid societies or these civic associations. And when we do, that leaves only the sort of the meat space stuff to be governed and fought over, right? So someone might say, well, we still got to worry about the roads. We still got to worry about zoning in some area. Okay. But if that's all we're doing in meat space, we're in figuring out how to protect a jurisdiction, through police powers or standing armies, many of which can be polycentric as well. Let's see how much we can do, because in injecting those competitive forces and allowing people to opt into situations that comport more with their conceptions of the good is the way we're going to get closer and closer to a condition of peace and freedom, instead of always fighting over it through political means.
That'll give less and less. The more we move online into a polycentric system, the less will be determined in meat space, as you put it. And that means the less our votes will determine.
Yes.
And that will
now,
give...
internal to that association, there may be democratic consensus mechanisms. Okay. And then I may decide halfway through, it's like, okay, everybody voted to do X. I preferred doing Y. So when I reach the end of my subscription cycle here, I'm going to defect and go to another one that has Y.
So we can reduce we can do both. We can decentralize with our online, with our digital governance, and we can shrink the size of government in meat space.
Yes.
Because it will handle less. It will handle some things, but it will handle less. And I think decentralization is so important, because I see what, at least in the Western world that I've researched to a degree, you look at the kinds of scandals that happen, the kind of evil that propagates at the top of these hierarchies. And it just, not to excuse it, but it just seems like wherever there's this amount of power, you're going to have evil occur. You're going to have trafficking and the worst things imaginable. Like, I don't know if it attracts these kinds of people or if it just perverts their soul in such a way that it turns them into these beasts. But if we can reduce that power, then I think we'll reduce the evil. We're not going to get rid of a darker side of who we are. But if there is less at the top to exploit, less power at the top to exploit, because there's many tops, then that I think will, just help humanity in general.
You just gave a synopsis of a really good book on that very subject. 3 books, actually. It's called the Lord of the Rings trilogy.
Yeah, exactly.
I think, and I was talking to my family the other night about this, and it occurs to me
they don't decentralize the ring, though. They just destroy it.
They destroyed it. Yeah, they
could have turned it into like 200 different rings. No. We're just gonna get rid of it.
Yeah, I guess that would be the same thing. And I guess if everybody's invisible, they're just knocking into each other. But the point of the symbol is, and it comes from the Ring of Gyges, the ancient Greek myth, that confers some power to act with impunity. If you can't see me, I can act with impunity, right? I can steal the pie off the windowsill. I can put my hand up the lady's skirt. I can do whatever I want, right? That, writ large, is political power, right, is the ability to act with impunity. This is why the FBI and the CIA and these other three-letter agencies are so scary, because they're in a very great sense above the law and above any kind of accountability. That makes me very uncomfortable, especially as it tends to, it builds the apparatus of a totalitarian state when that is possible. But yeah, I mean, I have been really interested in the idea of mythic truth lately. And I like to use the Lord of the Rings as an example, because the symbol of the ring as being a corruptive force, the ring symbolizes power. And power as a corruptive force is a very real thing. Even though there was literally never a man named Gandalf or a hobbit named Frodo Baggins, there is still this truth that is symbolized by the ring. And that truth is that power corrupts, as Lord Acton says. I think it was Lord Acton. So that is the kind of thing that those kind of mythic truths, which you won't find in scientific materialism. Mythic truths are things that we need to reacquaint ourselves with and explore. And if people do that through religious means, I say go with God, whatever it takes. Read the Bible, read the Lord of the Rings. If you think the Bible is mythical, some people think it's true. I'd say it's at the very least mythic truth, has a lot of mythic truth. And this goes back to the spiritual nourishment piece, I think, that we're going to have to find again in our lives. And I think I'm becoming more and more persuaded that decentralization technologies are not enough, that we need to prime ourselves spiritually for the task of decentralization. And then it'll happen.
So do you follow politics, or are you sort of like, nah, I'm not worried about that. There's a flood coming. I need to build the ark.
I mean,
Or
I
are you,
follow it.
okay.
I drink my coffee and something comes on and I'll listen to it. And I like to stay aware of things, My wife and I, our political dispositions diverge. So we're a mixed household, and we talk about these subjects, and I liked to stay apprised of them. But after Trump was elected, things got really bad in the House, and I don't want to be an apologist for Trump, but I also don't necessarily want to, in an effort not to be an apologist for Trump, try to, not argue against bad policies that originate on the left. So in any case, yeah, I still do, but I don't think I don't think a steady diet of it is good for you. I think it needs to be a smaller part of the mix in our lives, where we start to work on the transition.
Yeah, it's like, maybe in a subconscious way, as we recognize that it's becoming less and less effective, ethical, yet we spend more and more time worried about it, as a whole, like as a society. Maybe we're scared that it's becoming dysfunctional, if just by recognizing the dysfunction on the side that you don't like more.
Right.
And it scares us, and that fear grips us, and et cetera. Hey,
Well,
let's...
and
Go ahead.
if we're not playing tug of war and we're playing games of sweet talk, these are two different, tug of war is, I want to persuade you to come on to my team so that we can take over and put our conception of the good down everybody else's throats. That's politics. With sweet talk, I want to start a community, an organization, an association, and it could scale to 2 million people, where we help each other, we lift each other up when we fall, we have to manage our budgets wisely, all that good stuff. But it's an opt-in situation. We have to engage in sweet talk. And so I think the substrate of that is we have to preserve the spirit of free speech, not just the letter, which means we got to keep talking to each other, and we got to keep doing so in a way that's less acrimonious and more about sweet talk. I can persuade you that this is the way, that this is a better way than this one. So you'll opt into this situation. It's marketing. It's persuasion versus compulsion. And that I think is an important thing to maintain as a basic cultural substrate of a healthy society, is that we talk about things and we can agree to disagree without violence. But,
It's also self-care, because we're happier when we're chill and we're not tugging on that rope or attacking.
Right. I've had to discipline myself because I can ruin my day by getting on, Facebook and arguing with people. It's just toxic, and it doesn't amount to any earthly good. So I've stopped doing that. That's one of the downsides of social media, is that it presents sort of acrimonious. I have to, in front of all these other people, I have to show up as being right. And that tends to amount to tit for tat and arguments that get buried in a sea of who gives a crap, right? And you've wasted your whole day.
I try to remember that, like, right now, down at the Legion or wherever, at the gym or wherever, there are two people engaged in a conversation or a group that I find completely abhorrent, and like, man, you guys are way off with your facts. Now, am I going to walk down? If someone told me that was happening, would I walk down there right now and try to straighten them out? Well, no, I would put my boots on here in this weather and walk down. So if I encounter a thread, why do I feel the need to jump in? For the same reason why, when you overhear it in your vicinity, you feel the need to say, well, wait a minute. It's that same kind of idea. Last thing. We've talked so much about decentralizing government, and then, but the idea struck me that what we're seeing, though, in the commercial or business world is not decentralization. We are seeing these monopolies, tech monopolies. We're talking about doing more and more online, and we've got these, Magnificent Seven, they're called. They could have called it a lot of things. I guess the finance world called it that, and it stuck. But do you envision, and I think you and I come from a place where we're a little more concerned about government power because it's the monopoly of force, and it's a bit more imposing, or even a lot more imposing than a corporate or business monopoly. But business monopolies, of course, can be imposing too, and harmful and damaging, greatly so. So do you see something that would appease those who might lean left and be a bit more worried about corporate abuse than government abuse, and how the internet and our future as healthier people might move us in a direction to where we don't have or have less monopolies, less abuse from that corporate world level?
Yeah, I do. I am gravely concerned about corporate power too. I see some of the most unhealthy forms of corporate power coming, especially when there is collusion or unholy alliances with government actors or state proxies. So, for example, the military-industrial complex, the Magnificent Seven, helping, giving your data to state actors or other corporations, selling you bit by bit.
Yeah,
I do have grave concerns about that, and I do see that the most evil state of affairs, or the most deleterious set of results, is when you have a system where corporations and governments collude to benefit themselves. And this is the direction we're headed in as a country. That's what fascism literally means, is when governments direct the economy through dirigisme and direct corporations to its particular ends. That is the true definition of fascism, which is why I get really annoyed when people who spend their days in, days out advocating for fascist policies or corporativist policies call other people fascists, because
Right.
I don't think they really understand what the word fascist means. They just throw it around because they think it's another F-bomb to throw at someone they don't like. But you are accepting fascism when you support, a regulation that allows an incumbent industry to maintain its power and makes it increasingly difficult for newcomers and upstarts to enter the market. Or when you receive a bunch of government subsidies, when the government functions as a monopsony. That's all unhealthy dynamics for an economy, and it creates cartels, oligopolies, and frankly, it reduces the number of opportunities for small upstarts to enter the game, which is where the action is in terms of real social progress, in my view.
So you're thinking that we reduce, more, we introduce more decentralization. More decentralization just evolves naturally out of the power of the internet. And by that, it will then reduce the amount of corporate abuse, because they won't have the monopoly government anymore, the huge monopoly Leviathan government anymore to work in collusion with them.
Yeah, I mean, Prospera, I don't know how to correctly say it, is one of few great examples. So right now there are companies, small biotech companies incorporating there, and they are responsible for testing different kinds of drugs or treatments or what have you, but they can do it outside the auspices of the United States FDA, for example, which takes 10 to 15 years and usually $1 billion to get something like this to market. And nobody except the big incumbent industries has that kind of money to do anything like that. It's really, really hard to do medical, pharma, or biotech startups.
Yeah.
You're trying to do it around one compound and trying to raise $1 billion with the hopes that it passes muster, passes the regulatory morass. Whereas these little jurisdictions allow you to do a different kind of testing regime and have common law instead of statutory regulations. They're regulated by insurance. So the insurance companies come and say, we want to see what you're doing and what you're going to want to sell. And the insurers essentially help you regulate, but specific to the compound or product or service that you're providing. And I think it's a really interesting model. But sort of telescoping out from that, there's also just I think, what I call subversive innovation. And I beat this to death. And this is a good note on which to close. I hope you will think, because I'm late for calling my boss now, but you're worth it, Brandon. The subversive innovation is a 3-part model for how to view innovation in the post Satoshi era. The first part is reduce your technology, your innovations to somehow reduce transaction or cooperation costs, right? Make it less costly for people to lateralize their relationships, whether transactional or cooperative. 2, raise predation and parasitism costs. Make it harder for government actors, big corporations, or criminals to be a parasite or a predator on you, the user, right? And then the third part is lower exit costs. It means which is also called in economics switching costs. So make it easier to go from one system to another that is more beneficial to you. People who use those three rules of thumb in the background of their thinking when they innovate will do very well indeed to bring about the social singularity and get us closer to a state of affairs that you and I think is going to be much healthier for society. And you don't have to engage in politics to do it, frankly.
Right. Well, the book, The Sovereign Individual, talks about a post-politics world.
Yeah.
And that was another mind-blowing thing. Like, what do you mean post-politics? How could there not be politics?
Talking about being pissed off. I had about 10% of the social singularity left to write when I came across that book, The Sovereign Individual, and thought, you motherfuckers, excuse my mouth again, these guys beat me by 20 years. And they sure had. It's a great book.
Yeah. Well, so is yours. So are all
Thank
yours.
you.
They work very well together as a series. So we'll
We
have
stand
all
on
that
the shoulders
info.
of giants, and I
Yeah, we
love those
do.
guys.
Amen. Thanks, Max, for your time. Very generous with your time today, this morning.
Yes, sir.
And keep up all the great work. And I look forward to talking to you more about all your different projects. And maybe we'll cross paths again in Prospera.
I look forward to it, Brandon. Thank you very much, sir.